Okay, so Tracy, do you think parents and whānau should be sexuality educators of their children?
I love that word, should be. All parents and whānau are sexuality educators. All adults are. And we know that our young people are learning from everywhere. But parents and whānau play a really important role, don't they, from a very young age. They're sending messages to their children. Their children are also watching them, how they navigate relationships. They're constantly learning. And it's interesting you asked that question, because I've just finished a big research project around this. And what's really important, some of the really important findings, is that parents are really supportive. They want sexuality education for their children. They want to do it, and they also want schools to do it. And that's an important point too, because a lot of people say, well, is it the home or is it the school? You know, whose role is sexuality education? But as you and I have found out, it's everyone's role. Young people want to hear from the adults in their lives. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a nice combination, because I think when we do it at school, they have a different type of adult talking to them. They hear lots of different opinions from the adults in the room and from the young people in the room, and that might expose them to a lot of things that they haven't thought. But when we're doing it at home, they get our values and our ideas as well. And our kids want to know what we think. And so I think it's really important that we let them know. And while that's happening, they're getting lots of different opinions, and so they can form their own opinion from that, because we want our young people to be critical thinkers. And if we only give them one view, then they haven't got enough to critique. Whereas if they're getting lots of views, they can take all the bits that they like, that they think suits them, and develop their sense of self from that.
That's a really important point, because the parents that I worked with in my research, they all said, we think it's a combination deal. That was the words they used. And they're recognising in the digital world that school sexuality education can play a part in that, can really help them to navigate the digital world and to hear what other people think, but also to critique things like the media, to develop those skills. And I think that's crucial, isn't it? The skills to become critical thinkers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think over my years of doing sexuality and relationship education, I had a number of parents say, oh, but the school's doing it, so we can step back and let the school do it, you know. And I think when you have that conversation with parents around the fact that their kids want to know their stuff, a bit of a light bulb moment for a lot of adults just to sit back and think, actually, yeah, I do have a lot of knowledge. I've been through all of these stages. Yes, it might have been a wee while ago, and yes, society might be a bit different now, but actually I do have a lot of opinion on this, and I do want my child to know what I think, and I'd like to teach them the skills that I've learned so that they can take those forward as well.
But also talk with them about what skills do they need now going forward in a different world. Because some parents do feel a bit like, I don't understand the digital world, I don't know what to do. But if you don't know, that's the time to ask. And it's interesting with a comment you just made. I remember my son was doing some lessons around consent at high school. And, you know, as a sexuality educators, we ask, oh, what did you do today? And so he talked about consent, and I said, oh, okay. So what would you do in this situation? And then we started talking about those grey areas. And like, oh, we ended up talking for half an hour just about some of the complexities. Because, you know, consent is not quite as simple as what people think it is. You know, there's a lot more complexities around gender stereotypes and what impacts on that. But we had such a cool discussion. Yeah, cool. And I let him talk. That was the key point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we let our kids talk and let our kids ask us questions, then they get to drive it. And I think if they feel in control of that conversation, they're going to want to have it more often. If they're just sitting there just listening, then they're not as engaged with that. So I think it is a real two-way conversation, and to let our kids just ask what they need to know, because then that gives us confidence that we're not going too fast for them.
And that's the point I want to pick up on. So in my research, you just said it's a two-way conversation. That came through as one of the most strongest findings, that you have to think of relationships and sexuality education, or being a parent sexuality educator, as a shared two-way conversation.
Absolutely.
Because many parents shared stories when they tried to be the expert and tell their child a certain way or to do a certain thing, but actually it never worked. And they often then talked about how they had to have a conversation. And actually that was really beneficial. They learnt, the child learned, and they actually opened up more communication lines.
Yeah.
There were so many good stories like that.
No,
and,
there were.
and I have to say, the parents that I worked with were amazing. They are trying a whole wide range of strategies, and lots of them felt nervous. So they were like uncertain if they were doing it the right way. But they were trying, and that was the most important thing. And actually, what I said to many of them was, we have to stop thinking of it as a right way, because realistically, conversations are about navigating those difficult spaces, the uncertainty of relationships, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think if I had a top tip for parents, it would be focus on the positive and the strengths as opposed to the negative and the fear-based. Because I think when we had our term, when we were teenagers, if we got anything from our parents or from school, it was very negative based. It was very, don't do this, don't do this. If you do that, these bad things will happen. And as we know as Kiwis, when we're told not to do something, we tend to go do it anyway just to find out. So I think if we keep it really strength based, and you can do that in a conversation, that we're talking about the positives. There's a whole load of really yummy, nice stuff around sexuality and relationships. And so we don't need to focus on the doom and gloom, because that tends to put our young people off, and they're more likely to stop coming and talking to us.
And that's the key point. We don't want them to stop having those conversations. And even now with my children as late teens, we still have really interesting conversations about the world and making sense of the world. But I have to let them talk, because even though sometimes you want to jump in, you've got to let them do it. And I also want to pick up on another point you said about the whole danger and fear-based sexuality education. Again, that was a really strong finding in my research, where many of the parents I interviewed talked about their past sexuality education, very much based around fear, all the danger element, none of the joy. And so for some of them, that had lifelong consequences on how they feel about their bodies and their future relationships. So we've got to make sure that that doesn't happen. We have to empower young people to have a strong sense of identity, communication skills, and think about the importance of relationships and communication. I mean, it's all communication, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we know as adults, there's a lot of amazingly yummy stuff in relationships. And yes, there's some stuff that's not so good, and that's important to talk about. It's just not important to focus on. And we can focus on the negative by talking about the positive. Because if we're building up people's skills and understanding of what makes a positive thing, then there's much less likely to be the negative in there.
And that's such a great point. And again, that came through with all my research as well. And young people are telling us throughout New Zealand they want to talk about some of these things. And for example, we talk with parents about how do you talk with your children around pornography, because many young people are learning about sex or are curious about sex, so they're looking at pornography. But actually what they want is the conversations around what's a healthy relationship. Tell me about sex and sexuality, and open those conversations. But interestingly, when you've got those teenagers, that's when they start to close down again. So those foundational skills from, birth, primary school, about how to negotiate relationships and intimacy are just crucial, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's cool.